Welcome to Podkey Slopcast, where today's AI stories get separated from their own marketing. A lot of this week's AI news sounds huge on first read. The more interesting question is who actually gets leverage out of it, and what breaks if the promised payoff never quite arrives. NVIDIA's Vera Rubin's story matters because it nudges the AI conversation away from the old assumption that the GPU is always the star of the show. The headline product here is RTX Spark, a prosumer chip that pairs a Vera CPU with a Rubin GPU, with roughly 20 CPU cores, more than 6,000 integrated GPU cores, up to 128 gigabytes of unified memory, and around a petaflop of AI compute aimed at personal on-device workloads. On paper, that sounds like a direct shot at Apple's M-series playbook. Tight integration, shared memory, local AI, and a pitch that your machine can run meaningful models without bouncing every task to the cloud. The bigger claim is that Vera Rubin is built for agentic AI, and that's where the analysis gets more interesting. Training still loves giant GPU clusters, but agents doing actual work tend to spend a lot of time orchestrating steps, calling tools, handling memory, parsing outputs, and waiting on external systems. That's not the same workload as raw model training. So the argument for a more CPU-centric future is plausible. If inference and tool execution become the dominant daily workload, then fast, efficient CPUs become central rather than secondary. Still, there's a difference between CPUs becoming more important and GPUs becoming less important. Those are not identical claims, and the stronger evidence supports the first one. What probably changes is the balance of the stack. More value moves to systems that can coordinate mixed workloads well, especially at the edge and in data centers where latency, power, and memory movement matter as much as peak benchmark bragging rights. And NVIDIA's incentive is obvious. If AI expands from training labs into every workstation and enterprise endpoint, it wants to own that transition too, not just the giant accelerator racks. Meta is reportedly working on AI-focused wearables, described as pendants for work, and the strategic logic is pretty clear even if the product category still feels shaky. Reality Labs keeps losing money, about $4 billion in operating losses against roughly $402 million in revenue in the reported period. So Meta needs some path from expensive hardware experimentation to a recurring AI business. A wearable could be less about hardware margins and more about distribution. If it keeps you inside Meta's assistant and subscription ecosystem all day, the device is really a funnel. But the hard part is behavior, not just engineering. People have to want another always-on device, trust it around work, and find it useful often enough to justify the friction. That trust question got worse because Meta also suffered a serious security failure. An AI-driven password reset bot reportedly accepted AI-generated videos for identity verification, which let attackers hijack verified Instagram accounts and bypass two-factor authentication. If that's accurate, the issue is bigger than one breach. It suggests an automation layer was granted authority without enough resilience against synthetic media, which is exactly the environment these companies say they're preparing for. The contradiction is painful. The same industry selling AI assistants everywhere is also making security decisions in a world where AI can cheaply fake identity signals. So Meta's wearable push and its verification failure belong in the same conversation. The company wants more intimate access to user context, but the standard for identity, privacy, and recovery has to get tougher at the same time, not looser. The Bain survey is one of the cleanest reality checks in this batch of stories. Nearly 40% of large firms reported AI-driven cost savings below 10%, even though many had been targeting 11 to 20% automation savings. That doesn't mean AI isn't useful. It does mean the financial case is often arriving slower, messier, and with more organizational drag than the slide decks implied. And then there's the sharper warning. About 44% said they plan to fund future AI investments based on assumed savings. That's a circular bet. If the savings don't materialize on schedule, the next round of investment is being financed by a result that was more forecast than fact. The second-order effect is easy to miss. Companies may keep spending because pulling back looks like strategic weakness, while the budget logic underneath gets more fragile. This also helps explain Walmart's move. It ended an unlimited token policy for its internal code puppy agent and shifted to capped budgets paired with more employee training. That can sound stingy, but it's also what operational maturity looks like. Unlimited usage makes sense when you want experimentation. Caps make sense when demand spikes. Supply is constrained, and you finally care about whether 100 tiny queries are creating real value. Training matters here too. If workers are mostly using agents for presentations and spreadsheet tasks, better prompting and better workflow design may save more money than simply buying more tokens. The broad pattern is that AI economics are moving out of the demo phase. Companies now have to measure substitution, not just activity. Anthropic confidentially filing for an IPO and trying to move fast before OpenAI is a classic timing game, but in this market, timing is part narrative and part information strategy. Going first can shape the story. It can make Anthropic feel like the disciplined public market AI company before investors have another comparable name to benchmark against. But there is a real advantage to going second. OpenAI could watch how audited AI financials are received, see what public investors actually reward or punish, and use that information when setting price and timing. So there isn't a universally correct move here. First mover gets attention, second mover gets evidence. That ties into Google's decision to raise $80 billion in its first equity issuance in over 2 decades, with Berkshire Hathaway putting in $10 billion and lifting its Google stake to around $32 billion. For Google, the signal is that AI build-out is expensive enough and strategically important enough to justify broadening the financing toolkit even with the stock up about 18% year to date. For Berkshire, the message looks less like speculative AI hype and more like confidence that Google remains one of the few firms with the cash flow, distribution, and infrastructure to translate AI spending into durable position. Still, equity raises dilute. Public investors will tolerate that if they believe the capital is funding defensible capacity rather than an arms race with no margin discipline at the end. The most genuinely political story here is the fight over who should benefit if AI creates enormous wealth. Bernie Sanders' AI Sovereign Wealth Fund Act proposes a 50% government stake in major US AI firms, with dividends to citizens modeled on Alaska's oil fund. The moral case is straightforward. If AI systems are built from collective knowledge, public institutions, and broad social data, then the gains shouldn't pool entirely with a narrow set of shareholders and founders. OpenAI and Anthropic have both floated public wealth ideas in white papers too, which is notable because it means the concept is not coming only from anti-corporate critics. But there are 2 separate questions that often get blended together. One is ownership of financial upside. The other is whether AI is actually deployed toward public goals. Ezra Klein's argument gets at that split. A dividend is nice, but it doesn't by itself build better public services, define mission priorities, or guarantee access to the data and compute needed for public interest uses. And Sanders' specific 50% stake proposal would run straight into enormous practical and political resistance. How do you value the firms? Which firms count? And what happens to investment incentives if ownership terms become coercive or unpredictable? That doesn't make the underlying concern weak. In fact, the concern is strong. AI could concentrate wealth and decision-making power even further unless some mechanism spreads the gains. What's unsettled is the mechanism. A sovereign wealth model, taxation, compute access, public procurement, or direct public AI infrastructure all imply very different trade-offs. The strongest conclusion right now is not that one proposal has already won. It's that the ownership question is moving from fringe theory into mainstream strategic debate because the scale of potential upside is now too large to ignore. That's the picture this week. More AI money, more AI hardware, and a lot more pressure to prove the value is real. Thanks for listening to Podkey Slopcast. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.